everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 117 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're gonna let it breathe because we're gonna talk about the rib cage. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it's all about the rib cage today for episode 117 because your boy Big Z has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Stephen. Here's what Stephen asks. Hi, Zach. Around how long do you recommend for each of the three general steps, improving bucket handle, pump handle, and posterior expansion, before moving on to the next area if a client is doing the relevant exercises daily or twice a day? Thank you, Stephen, for a great question. A couple things. First, I want to discuss the order that Stephen is talking about when improving rib cage dynamics. Stephen lists bucket handle, pump handle, and posterior expansion in that order. And that's not necessarily cut and dry with each person. In order to gain insight into why that is, we have to look at why these areas become restricted and with who. The first thing I want to clear up is that Stephen is right. I want to prioritize the bucket handle mechanism first in terms of making that area dynamic. With improving movement capabilities, we want to look at improving or restoring normal respiratory mechanics. And the big piston that leads to your ability to maximize those respiratory dynamics is making sure that the thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor are stacked atop one another. As you breathe in, both diaphragms should relatively descend, and as you breathe out, both diaphragms should relatively ascend. Most people who have compensatory mechanics or movement restrictions lack that capability. So we want to restore that first. If I can keep a stacked position, or attain a stacked position, I should say, of those two diaphragms, that gives me the potential to expand into the entire rib cage. If you don't have the bucket handle mechanism restored, you can't do it. So we need that first. Now, let's talk about prioritizing posterior expansion versus pump handle. And I'm going to go into a broad get air in the back, get air in the front. As we'll talk about later, we can get even more specific. But let's just talk about air in the back, posterior expansion versus air in the front first. We have to look at, in both of those cases, is the restriction in posterior expansion or anterior expansion due to the rib cage structure or due to secondary compensatory mechanisms? In order to gain insight into that, we have to look at what is the normal compensation that should accompany different infrasternal angle presentations. With a narrow infrasternal angle, that is a measure that occurs when there is an inhalation bias in the spine. If there's an inhalation bias in the spine, I should have the ability to expand posteriorly. But what I might lack is actually the ability to expand anteriorly, because I can get all this air in the back because of the inhaled position at the spine. That leads to a subsequent loss of the ability to expand in the front once I've succumbed to compensatory mechanics. Because in this situation, you still got to get air in, but your only option, because of the eccentric orientation of the axial skeleton, is posteriorly. If you have a narrow infrasternal angle presentation who presents with a restriction in pump handle mechanics or anterior expansion, you may actually get a restoration of the pump handle mechanics by focusing on bucket handle restrictions. Because if I can restore the dynamics at the bucket handle and improve the dynamics of the axial skeleton, the pump handle mechanics may be restored on their own. You can see this, and the reason why I've been focusing more on this is because of screw-ups I've had with patients. A lot of times if I saw someone with a narrow infrasternal angle presentation and I went with a pump handle fix, which normally would be reaching with the arms overhead to some degree, a lot of times that would actually increase some of the restrictive actions that were occurring at the rib cage. And the reason why is because when you go into, say, 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, there's more scapular upward rotation occurring. And one of your big upward rotators of the scapula is the serratus anterior. The action of the serratus anterior on the rib cage is to compress it laterally. If I'm a narrow infrasternal angle and I activate a muscle that increases the compressive actions on the rib cage laterally, which is what the narrow infrasternal angle is, you may actually be reinforcing the restrictions. If you have a narrow infrasternal angle with pump handle restrictions, addressing the bucket handle action first and foremost, more often than not will improve that, because a restriction in pump handle mechanics is a normal thing to have with a narrow infrasternal angle. Let's flip-flop that for a wide infrasternal angle. A wide infrasternal angle is a compensatory mechanism that happens when the axial skeleton is exhaled. Things are going forward. If you don't fully grasp the inhalation and exhalation strategies, I would strongly look into my free Human Matrix Foundations course, which I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/ribcage. Exhaled axial skeleton accompanies a wide infrasternal angle. I got a good debrief that talks about this as well. In that case, those individuals should actually have a restriction in posterior expansion. If I block off the back, it's going to be easier to get air in front. So they may actually have increased mobility into the anterior part of the rib cage, which is normal. If you have someone who has posterior rib cage restrictions and they're a wide infrasternal angle, your first order of defense to improve those restrictions ought to be restoring the bucket handle mechanics. If it's a wide, you would choose things that compress the sides of the rib cage. Maybe that's reaching at 120, maybe that's side plank variations. And a lot of times if you really focus your efforts on that, you will see restrictions that would indicate a posterior expansion restriction clean up. Another screw up, and the reason why I've been focusing on this route, is when I've done activities that incorporate a low reach, 0 to 60, which we would normally do to improve posterior expansion in the rib cage. Many times with wide infrasternal angle presentations, they've had a markedly difficult time getting that posterior expansion with the low reach. And the reason why is because I did not spend enough time restoring the bucket handle dynamics. If I have a wide ISA and they have a dynamic lower rib cage, they should be able to create some expansion posteriorly, because that is a primary restriction that's present. So with that in mind, let me just recap real quick. Narrow infrasternal angle. It's normal for a narrow ISA to have restrictions anteriorly in the pump handle mechanism. For a wide infrasternal angle, it's normal to have restrictions posteriorly in posterior expansion. Restore the dynamics first at the lower rib cage and the pelvis before you go driving too much stuff into those areas. Because a lot of times if you restore those lower rib cage dynamics, it should clean up. Now, let's suppose that I have a person who is a narrow infrasternal angle who also has a posterior restriction. Or I have a wide infrasternal angle who has restrictions anteriorly. Once you've restored the bucket handle mechanism, then you would go and attack those areas. So I teach that person to have normal mechanics In the cases of those two restrictions, a narrow who's restricted posteriorly and a wide who's restricted anteriorly, those would be secondary layers of compensation. So it would be compensation atop of compensation. For those folks, you may have to do targeted interventions to take care of those restrictions first because they're not part of the normal restrictions that you might see with those infrasternal angle presentations. In the case of a narrow who has posterior restrictions, you might look at reaching low or even reaching high. In the case of a wide who has restrictions in pump handle, you may think about reaching in the 60 to 120 range or even above. All of those factors could work when we're discussing narrow and wide infrasternal angles who have secondary restrictions. But the piece most people gloss over is knowing what should happen with a base level narrow and wide, and making sure that you're focusing a lot of efforts on the bucket handle mechanics before going into driving things in the upper thorax. Let me summarize that one more time. Narrow infrasternal angle should have restrictions in the front, which would be your IR measures. If you improve the dynamics of the lower rib cage, that should improve the restrictions anteriorly. If you have a narrow who has restrictions posteriorly on top of that, still focus on the bucket handle first. That should clean up some of the pump handle, and then you want to drive air posteriorly. If I'm a wide, they should have restrictions posteriorly. You want to address that first by improving bucket handle dynamics. If the wide ISA has restrictions anteriorly, still clean up the bucket handle mechanism first, then you want to focus your efforts on driving air anteriorly. The second part of Stephen's question is how long should you focus on improving these restrictions? And the answer is person dependent. If we take two people who are beginners and they want to learn piano, how long is it going to take them to be able to play Elton John? I think the answer is very person dependent. Some person might pick it up real quick and they can get the keys going and they get the glasses that Elton John had and they're getting wild and crazy. But another person, it may take them longer. There's inherent differences in terms of how fast and quick that we learn things. Generally speaking though, if I were to say, how long do I spend teaching someone a concept? I will generally keep someone performing the same exercises from 1 to 3 weeks, depending on a few factors. 1, how often I'm seeing them, and 2, how long does it take them to demonstrate competency in that specific exercise. Once that exercise looks good, they're feeling what they need to feel, and I'm seeing positive changes in some other things, whether it's testing or whether it's their training program, then I feel confident at moving on. With some of the basic concepts that we talked about, stacking or working on bucket handle mechanics, you really can't hammer these basics enough. And you're going to run into mistakes more often than not when you jump too fast into the next progression. So I encourage you to slow cook the brisket, so to speak, when we're talking about movement. If you want it to turn out good, you want to slow cook that brisket. You want to spend time focusing on the fundamentals, because if you go too fast, you're going to burn the brisket, you're not going to get the movement mechanics restored that you so desire, and your clients will suffer because of it. So take your time with progressing people. Throw in, really hone in, spend a lot of time on focusing on the basics before you get fancy. And then once they've seen some improvements in testing that sticks, or they're looking good at some of their training activities, better than when they started, that's when you know you can progress to the next move. Awesome question, Stephen. The next question comes from Patrick. Here's what Patrick asks. In one of your movement debriefs, you talk about being stuck in a pump handle down position, but you mentioned a bent manubriosternal joint. What is that? How does it happen? How do you test for it? Treatment. I tried to Google it, but didn't really get anywhere. Do you have any links you can share? Thank you. Believe it or not, folks, your sternum is broken up into 3 different pieces. At the top, the broad piece that's a little short and stubby is the manubrium. the first and second rib attached to the manubrium. Below that is the body of the sternum. That's the long, skinny piece. And then below that is the xiphoid process, which is the cartilaginous piece. Each of those pieces has movement to them to some degree. The top part, the portion between the manubrium and the body of the sternum, is called the manubriosternal joint, or the angle of Lewis. It does ossify later in life, but in the early stages of life, there is some degree of movement at that joint. The cool thing about this joint is, just like I can segment different parts of the posterior thorax, I can also segment different parts of the sternum. There is posterior superior expansion of the posterior thorax, which I would classify as T2 to T4, and there's posterior inferior expansion of the thorax, which I would classify as T6 to 8. T5 has crosstalk between both muscles, which is why I don't include that. I don't include T1 because the first rib is immobile. The same dichotomy happens at the sternum. I can have movement occur just at the manubrium, and I can have movement occur just at the body of the sternum. And here's the interesting thing. If you look at the attachment and the relationships between these four quadrants, and in the show notes, I will show you a cool graphic that links the different testing. But if you look at these four quadrants, the manubrium, the body of the sternum, T2 to T4, and T6 to T8, they actually parallel one another. At the manubrium, the first two ribs have attachments at the manubrium. So there's your relationship from T1 to T2 to the manubrium. If you look at the relationship of the manubrium to the thoracic spine, T2 and T4 is the level that is parallel to the manubrium. So the uppermost parts of the thorax, the manubrium and T2 to T4, are intimately related when we're talking about expansion and compression of the ribcage. So too is the body of the sternum and T6 to 8, probably T10. Those two areas of the thorax and the sternum are related in terms of location. I can have expansion and subsequently restrictions localized to those respective areas. How does a bend at the manubriosternal joint happen? It would happen if I have one of two things. If the manubrium is in an inhaled position, which would be anterior and superior, and the body of the sternum is exhaled, so it would be down and in, that would be one way to have a bend at the manubriosternal joint. The second way would be to have an exhaled manubrium, so the manubrium would be down and back, and the body of the sternum would be inhaled, so it would be anterior and superior. Just like I can have that shift in ribcage expansion as well. You can have folks who are exhaled in the lower parts of the posterior thorax, but inhaled in the upper parts of the thorax, although that's rare. And vice versa. I can be exhaled in the top parts of the posterior thorax, yet inhaled in the bottom parts of the posterior thorax. And that's how we can create bends between these two areas. How do I look at testing to see what type of presentation I have? You have to look at shoulder measures. And the cool thing is there are specific shoulder measures that can tell you where someone can and cannot get air. With posterior thorax expansion, I'm looking more at external rotation measures. With the ability to create pump handle or to look at my ability to put air into the front of the thorax, I'm looking at internal rotation-based measures. And that has to do with the relationship between the scapula and the humerus when I have expansion in those areas or not. Let me break down posterior expansion first. Let's say the posterior thorax as a unit is in an exhaled orientation. I can't get air into my back. If that's the case, the medial border of the scapula is going to be more compressed up against the rib cage. If I look at the rotator cuff muscles, what rotator cuff muscle would contribute to that compression of the medial border to the rib cage? If you look at the anatomy of the subscapularis, that would be your muscle. Internal rotation at the humerus is also external rotation at the scapula, and that's what compresses the medial border to the rib cage. Therefore, if I have a reduction in posterior expansion, the humerus is going to be more internally rotated, and if I'm concentric into internal rotation, I'm not going to be able to externally rotate my arm. Just as if my bicep is flexed, I can't extend my elbow. It's the same thing. With the pump handle, or the anterior part of the thorax, the opposite is true. In this case, you're going to have the medial border of the scapula come off of the rib cage. Things are going to be pulled more forward when the pump handle is down. If I have an internally rotated scapula, which is what you see when the medial border comes off the rib cage, the humerus is going to be more externally rotated because your posterior cuff muscles, infraspinatus and teres minor, have that same action. ER at the humerus equals internal rotation at the scapula. That is commonly seen when the pump handle, or I can't get air into the front. Let me summarize that real quick. If you lack posterior expansion, you're going to have ER restrictions because of concentric orientation of the subscapularis. If I have restrictions in pump handle mechanics, I'm going to have a limitation in internal rotation at the humerus because of concentric orientation of the infraspinatus and teres minor. And that happens because of the shape change or the positional change of the scapula. The scapula is going to be IR'd, the humerus is going to be ER'd. That means concentric action of the infraspinatus and teres minor occurs, and you can't drive internal rotation. How do I differentiate then the more superior parts of the thorax and the sternum, i.e. the manubrium, and the inferior parts of the thorax and the sternum, i.e. T6 to 8 and the body of the sternum? The answer is looking at the fiber orientation of your rotator cuff muscles. Let's look at the posterior thorax first. I'll have a picture of this in the show notes, but if you look at my hand, and my hand, let's say my thumb is the glenoid, and the body of my hand is the scapula, your subscapularis is going to have fibers that are more oblique in nature and more horizontal in nature. The horizontal fibers are on the superior part of the scapula, and the oblique fibers are on the inferior part of the scapula. And guess what, folks? The fiber orientation will correspond with different levels at the thorax. And how convenient is this? The horizontal fibers of the subscapularis are more in the T2 to T4 region, which is the upper part of the thorax. And the more oblique fibers are in the lower parts of the scapula, which would be T6 to 8. How cool is that? So if I have testing that looks at the horizontal fibers versus the oblique fibers, I can then delineate where air needs to go. Here are your tests, folks. In order to test the oblique fibers of the subscapularis, I'm going to put the humerus in a position so I have this diagonal fashion occurring with those fibers. Your test would be shoulder external rotation, because you can see my hand and the orientation of the subscapularis oblique fibers would be in line with one another. If you have external rotation restrictions, I will have a loss of expansion in the posterior thorax from T6 to T8. Those two things correlate with one another. If I'm talking about the horizontal fibers of the subscapularis. I need to put the humerus in line with those fibers to test their excursion. Your test for that, folks, is going to be horizontal abduction. Because as you can see, my humerus and my arm is now in line with those fibers. And when I go to put my arm into that horizontal abduction position, those horizontal fibers have to elongate in order for me to appreciate that range of motion. Another test you could do would be external rotation at the side of the body. If you have restrictions in either of those two tests, horizontal abduction or ER at 0 degrees of abduction, you likely have restriction in the horizontal fibers of subscapularis, and subsequently you lack the ability to get air into the uppermost parts of the thorax, namely T2 and T4. So what does that mean for the front side? On the front side of the body, if the manubrium correlates with T2 to T4 and the body of the sternum correlates with T6 to 8, then the measures should simply flip-flop because your infraspinatus and your teres minor have the same fiber differentiation as the subscapularis. There are horizontal fibers of the infraspinatus and teres minor, and there are oblique fibers. If I want to look at my ability to get air into the top part of the sternum, the upper part of the manubriosternal joint, I'm going to measure things that look at the horizontal fibers of infraspinatus and teres minor. Those tests would be horizontal adduction, because that puts the humerus in line with those fibers, and IR at 0 degrees of abduction. If you look at those two things and they are restricted, you know that you can't get air into the top part of the sternum. If I have a restriction in shoulder internal rotation, that's going to correspond with the body of the sternum, so the lower part of the pump handle. Because when I test internal rotation, that aligns the humerus with those oblique fibers of infraspinatus and teres minor. And that's how you can segment where you need to get air. So you can really, even though there's general posterior expansion or anterior expansion, you can break it down and get incredibly specific with where you need to drive air with specific people if you understand how the testing relates to the anatomical locations of where you can and cannot fill in air into the lungs. To summarize your awesome question, Patrick, the manubriosternal joint looks at the upper part of expanding the thorax versus the lower part of expanding the thorax, and you can have inhalation and exhalation restrictions segmented to each of those areas. If I want to look at improving the lower expansion in the lung field, so I'm looking at T6 to T8 in the posterior thorax and the body of the sternum in the anterior thorax, I'm going to look at external rotation at 90 degrees for posterior expansion. I'm going to look at internal rotation to look at improving the pump handle action at the body of the sternum. If I want to go upstairs, and I'm going to differentiate T2 to T4 expansion in the posterior thorax and an inhalation capability into the manubrium portion of the sternum, then I'm looking at, for the posterior thorax, horizontal abduction or ER at 0 degrees of abduction, or I'm going to look at, for the manubrium, horizontal adduction, as well as internal rotation at your side. And if you look at those tests and you spot specific restrictions, then you know where you need to direct airflow. And generally, if you see someone who's restricted at all, just like I get the stack first before I work on expanding into the upper parts of the body, I should look at expanding the lower parts of the thorax first before I go way up top. Now, if you're looking at how do I drive air into those specific areas, if I want to get posterior inferior expansion, that's where low reaches will come into play. If I want to get the body of the sternum to expand, I'm going to reach a little higher, and this has to do with the flexion arc that I've talked about before in a previous debrief, which I'll link. Lower reaches, 60 to 90 degrees we'll say, or 60 to 100, that will help you improve expansion into the body of the sternum. And then if you want to get A to P expansion and T2 to T4 and the manubrium, you're looking at going into progressively higher degrees of flexion. Awesome question, Patrick. Glenn, performance. How do you know if you are stacked properly? First way I would look at it is the eye test. What you should see is the pelvis should be underneath the person's body. So if you see the Jennifer Lopez kind of thing, sticking the butt out, which your boy Big Z is really good at, or you see someone doing the Fat Joe lean back where the pelvis is way forward, you know that in those two cases you do not have a stack. What should happen is the pelvis should be underneath the thorax. That would be one piece. To see if I have the top part of the stack, the ribs should be able to come down with the sternum staying parallel. I shouldn't see a bent position. I shouldn't see the thorax moving posteriorly. Those would be your telltale signs that someone has the capability of stacking. The next question comes from Dave. Here's what Dave asks. It seems like there's a contradiction behind the concepts of expansion relationships and length tension relationships and or muscle stiffness. But I figure it's because I'm not grasping something fundamental. I'm probably just teaching poorly, so I'll clarify, Dave. Let's say a client has a limitation in shoulder external rotation. This would seem to indicate that one causative factor is a lack of posterior expansion. In order to help drive the scapula out of adduction and internal rotation, there's our contention point, and restoring a better relationship of the GH joint, glenohumeral joint. But if I were to drive a position of posterior expansion, which usually entails contracting the pecs in order to compress the anterior chest wall, this might exacerbate stiffness in the pecs, further limiting ER at the glenohumeral joint. So it's important to concern ourselves with this contradictory dynamic relative to our goals. It seems like I could construct a similar example with IR restrictions too. Is it because breathing is such a metasystem that it affects these muscular relationships more powerfully than contractions ever could, or am I misunderstanding something? Great question, and this is coming very timely because I've been running into this struggle myself. The first thing I want to talk about is the ER restriction. We're not actually seeing the scapula adducted and IR'd if there is an external rotation restriction. What's happening in this case is the scapula is actually going to be externally rotated, and that's going to lead to a subsequent internal rotation orientation at the humerus. And the reason why is what we talked about before. The subscapularis is an internal rotator at the humerus, and it's also an external rotator at the scapula. When you drive posterior expansion, you want to reverse that relationship. I'm going to drive internal rotation at the scapula and external rotation at the humerus. That can be accomplished by doing low reach activities and also driving ER at the humerus. That being said, you did talk about, well, if I'm doing reaches to try to encourage posterior expansion, a lot of times I might be engaging the pecs. And I would agree with you in this case. I have this guy who I'm training, and the hardest thing I struggle with him is getting him to feel air expand posteriorly. He's a wide infrasternal angle, and he's compressed A to P. So he has like crazy limitations into ER, and he does falter with limitations into IR from time to time, although we can clean up internal rotation pretty quick. When I have him accomplish a low reach activity to try to get ER back or get posterior expansion so we can restore external rotation, because he's restricted in the front, he just boom, pecs everything. What that ends up doing, and this is where I think there's an issue, is when he kicks in the pecs, it downs the pump handle, it causes the thorax to tilt anteriorly, and you can't really get the expansion posteriorly in a uniform manner. What ends up happening is when I bend at the sternum, I oftentimes will hinge at a specific segment at the thorax, and you'll end up sealing off the uppermost parts of the thorax, because when I breathe in especially in T2 to T4, you're going to see expansion occur simultaneously. If you create a bend at the sternum by overpecking this, you won't be able to create that simultaneous A to P expansion. So what you want to do in that case is I need to be able to teach my folks, especially with these lower intensity activities, to be able to create a reach that drives posterior expansion without overpecking it. You know, pecs are good for the beach and impressing the ladies. This is why your boy struggles with that. But what it's not good for is getting posterior expansion if you're overpecking the situation. So what you want to encourage when you're doing a reach is to drive positions that would encourage posterior expansion without creating too much pec activity. When you're doing your low reaches, as an example, there's a couple ways you can do that. One, you could keep a relative external rotation position at the humerus as you reach. Since the pec is an internal rotator, that's going to put it at a disadvantage. Another good exercise, and I got this one from Bill, would be keeping the elbows bent, reaching this way, and then driving ER at the humerus like actively. So instead of having the arm straight, you could bend the arms and then drive ER at the humerus. That's another way to put the pecs at a disadvantage, but you'll still get some posterior expansion. Another thing to be mindful of is as you are performing a reach, you want to make sure that you don't bend at the sternum or you don't crunch down. If you do that, what's going to end up happening is the pecs will engage because the sternum is moving into a down pump handle position. One. Two, as you reach forward, the scapula are going to have a greater tendency to elevate. Your traps will pick up leverage on the reach, limiting your ability to get expansion into the uppermost parts of the thorax. If you focus predominantly on that, making sure you can reach without over-engaging the pecs, you should be able to get the posterior expansion that you so desire. I want to make sure I'm not having any compensatory actions occurring at the sternum, and if you do that, that's going to allow you to get that expansion in the posterior part of the thorax that you so desire. To summarize your great question, Dave, ER restrictions are not because of an internally rotated scap, it's because of an externally rotated scap. When you're reaching, especially with lower threshold or lower intensity activities, you do not want to use a superficial compressive strategy. You want to keep the pace low. You want to keep it low intensity, low key, if you know what I'm sizzling. So with your reaches, you want to encourage being able to reach without kicking in too much pec. Ways to do that would be keeping the arms a bit more externally rotated. You could also put them in the scapular plane, or you're doing bent elbow reaches while driving humeral external rotation. If you do those things, you ought to notice some good changes with your reaching, and you should be able to get subsequent posterior thorax expansion. The next question comes from Drew. Here's what Drew asks. Hi, Zach. I found your point about individuals with infrasternal angles ranging between 90 and 110 degrees really interesting, because I have not seen this covered before. If you get an opportunity to expand on that group of people in future podcasts, that would be great. What's your approach with them? I mentioned 90 to 110 degrees in my infrasternal angle debrief that I did recently, which will be in the show notes if you haven't checked it out. 90 or less is generally considered a narrow. 110 and above is generally considered a wide. What do you do about these mid-range groups of people? Usually, if you have someone in the mid-range, they're either a structural narrow who has utilized secondary compensatory strategies, or a structural wide who has used secondary compensatory strategies. Let me unpack that. A narrow infrasternal angle. Normally, those people should have an inability to move the lower rib cage laterally and superiorly. Bucket handle up, meaning that they can close the lower part of the rib cage. So they'll be able to make their infrasternal angle smaller, but they won't be able to expand it. A normal wide would be someone who can expand the rib cage outward and upward so the bucket handle can come up, but they can't close that that angle. They can't make the bucket handle come down, or they can't make their infrasternal angle smaller. The folks who are in the 90 to 110 range are limited in both directions. This would be a narrow infrasternal angle who can't really expand the rib cage or compress it, or a wide infrasternal angle who can't expand the rib cage or compress it. Those who are like 90 to 100, they're probably on the narrow side who have a secondary layer of compensation. Those who are at 100, 110, those would be more at a wide presentation. So that's how I would spread it out even further. So then, well, the answer is like, what's someone who's 100 on the nose? Well, like, make your judgment call. Do that. Does it look more narrow, or does it look more wide? What do you do with these folks? In these cases, you have to do activities that work on expanding or restoring the entire spectrum of bucket handle up and bucket handle down. And really, much doesn't change with the stacking type of coaching. In both cases, I still need to restore a full exhalation. With the narrow ISA and the wide ISA, even though I have different ribcage presentations, the diaphragm is still in a more descended position. We're just talking about a difference in degrees. A narrow infrasternal angle has a further descended diaphragm than a wide does. In that infrasternal angle debrief, I believe I talk about that. So in both cases, I still have to restore an ability to allow the diaphragm to ascend, which is a complete full exhalation. You want to do that first. Then, once I have a complete exhalation, I need to drive things to restore a normal inhalation. What a normal inhalation is I need to maintain some semblance of abdominal tension as I inhale. That's going to allow the normal bucket handle excursion to occur. And that's really the big difference when we're talking about what I need to do with people who are compressed in that mid zone. I need to spend a lot more time and be much more diligent about teaching normal respiratory mechanics than I would, say, someone who is way on the narrow or way on the wide. A lot of times those people who have those compensations can get the breathing a lot better down than someone who is in that mid-range. More often than not, people who have those secondary restrictions in the bucket handle mechanism likely also have secondary compensations throughout the body. And I can't really go into detail with that because you're going to look at individual specific restrictions that you'll have to address. I did talk about that in a previous debrief, so if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that, I will link that in the show notes. To summarize your great question, Drew, people who are in the mid zone can't bucket handle up or down. Your default way to fix that or improve those dynamics is to really slow cook the breathing sequence that we coach when we're talking about a stack or restoring normal respiratory mechanics. In order to do that, you want to make sure that they can achieve a stack position, get a full, complete exhalation so the diaphragm can attain an ascended position, and then make sure some ab tension is maintained as they inhale so that the ribs can move outward and upward. The last question comes from my homegirl, Becca. Here's what Becca asks. I never get to make it to your live debriefs, but before I forget, would you be able to do a question answer on how the body improves movement dynamics during right and left side bending, left and right thoracic abduction, and how does inhalation exhalation work? Do I have to be in left-right thoracic abduction before the trunk will rotate? Cool question. The big thing with side bending is if I do a side bend action on the thorax on one side, it's going to allow me to improve bucket handle action on the contralateral side. Exercises where I really encourage side bending is anything that's going overhead unilaterally. A great move would be a low sit, pull down. With this, I can pull a weight down, really side bend the trunk, and that's going to allow me to improve bucket handle mechanics on the contralateral aspect of the body because I'm stretching that side out, and when I breathe in, the lateral aspect of the rib cage as a unit has to be able to expand. Same thing if I go to the other side. Another good way to do that would be either an incline press or an overhead press, and you can use the low sit position as well. You got two kettlebells and you got them in the down position. You can side bend one side, press overhead, take a breath of air in, and that would also encourage bucket handle mechanics. This is a perfect exercise to do for a wide or a narrow infrasternal angle. With the wide infrasternal angle, the benefit is going to happen on the downside. The side that I side bend towards is going to give my external obliques a little bit better leverage to be able to compress the lower part of the rib cage. For a narrow infrasternal angle, they have to expand and blow out the lateral rib cage. They have to restore the ability to bucket handle out. For those, the reaching up position is going to be useful for encouraging the bucket handle expansion that we so desire. Now, what about those folks in the 90 to 110 range that we talked about before? Any type of pull down or alternating incline or overhead press variation is going to be money for those folks if you can encourage the side bend. I think of throwing side bending in the mix as a useful way for really working on improving those bucket handle dynamics. And that's really what it's about. Now, the second part of the question is, do I need to have that side bend before I rotate? The side bending is there to allow the bucket handle mechanics to occur. Rotation, especially in the upper parts of the thorax, require the bucket handle mechanism to be present. It's about achieving that stacked position before I throw air into the upper parts of the thorax. As I had mentioned before in a previous debrief, which will be linked, when I do any type of rotation, I'm going to have anterior expansion on one side and posterior expansion on the other. If I rotate my body to the right, that's going to be anterior expansion on the front side, or on the left-hand side, and posterior expansion on the right-hand side. And that has to do with changing the orientation of the spine. In order for you to maximize your rotational capabilities, it would behoove you to get that stacked position first. Some of your biggest rotators in your ventral cavity will be your obliques. If your obliques do not have leverage because of a loss of dynamics in the lower rib cage, it will impact your ability to rotate your body. You're always going to start there first, and utilizing side bending with pull downs or presses can be an extremely useful way to restore those bucket handle dynamics. Great question, Becca. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank wow, there was a bunch of you tuning in today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. I really appreciate all of you for being one of the fam. You mean the world to me. That's why I keep, spending a bulk of my time on Fridays to talk to you wonderful folks. If you want to learn more and support your boy so I can better support you, one of these days I'd like to upgrade the cameras and stuff so you can really see me in HD. Maybe it'll make me a little bit better looking. Perhaps the beard will be. Do I get the beard back? Do I keep the clean shaven? Upvote, downvote that. Let your boy know. Do I meet in the middle? I'm thinking I'll meet in the middle somewhere. But if you want to learn more, go to zachcouples.com. Subscribe to my newsletter while you're there. Here's what you're going to get with this newsletter, folks. You're going to get so much stuff, it's disgusting. You'll get access to the Human Matrix Foundations course, which is the precursor to my Human Matrix seminar. And this is why you need to subscribe to the newsletter, the Common Compensations Notebook, which will allow you to look at the way your coaching movement and the compensations you see differently. It's going to make it simpler. So you want to get that Common Compensations workbook and go through the free Human Matrix course. You'll get 5 hours of talks, you'll get a free acute quantic workload calculator, and you'll get goodies from your boy every Friday in your email. The hot and not on the internet, well actually more the hot, I will pass that along to you. Also on zachcouples.com, I offer some services. The first I have to talk about is Human Matrix, my seminar. I am going to be doing these live once things are deemed safe via COVID-19. So the next one that I have available is August 1st and 2nd in Boston, Massachusetts, assuming that things are back to normal by then. September 12th and 13th in Montreal. October 3rd and 4th in Ann Arbor, Michigan. November 7th and 8th in Charlotte, North Carolina. November 21st, 22nd in San Diego, California. And then May 1st and 2nd, 2021 in Minneapolis. I ended up moving that one. Other ways you can support your boy or support yourselves. How about that? Services I can offer you. I offer movement consultations. If you're toying, you're not moving as well as you'd like to, or hey, Zach, I have restrictions in my shoulder motion and I'm not sure what to do. Well, I am a little bit more sure of what to do. You know, there's always a probability of not hitting it 100%, but I've worked with a lot of people online in improving some of those restrictions. Or if you have clients who have restrictions, that's impacting their ability to do upper body stuff that you want to program, a movement consultation can help. What we can do is I will look at your movement capabilities. I will provide you activities to improve those movement capabilities, and then you can bust through those restrictions and work on whatever goal it is that you have. We can kick that up a notch too and apply that in a training context. I can write a training program for you based on that movement consultation that respects your movement restrictions, focuses on improving your movement quality as well as your fitness simultaneously. It is the most specific program you can get for yourself. Definitely sign up for online training. Or if you want to learn how to do that with your folks, the mentoring process is a great way of doing that. We will look at how to apply these concepts to your specific population or clientele, especially if you're working remote now, because your boy has a little bit of experience with that. And I will give you homework. You'll have ways to practice and implement this stuff the next day into your practice. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, the blogs, all that stuff, search me on the Zach Couples Show on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Because guess what, folks? There are 116 other debriefs, and maybe you prefer Zach with the beard, or you prefer Zach without the beard, or you just don't like how Zach looks, period, and you just don't want to see me. You want to listen to me. That's where iTunes or Apple Podcasts and Stitcher can come into play. While you're there, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Social media-wise, I'm on Facebook/ZCouples. Twitter handle is @ZCouples. Of course, that Instagram, baby! Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And YouTube. I have a huge exercise library on YouTube that you can experiment with to improve some of the restrictions that you have. I'm working on, especially with my newer moves, showing you when you should use people or what the indications are for specific exercises. Play around, see what works for you or what works for your clients. Thank you again for tuning in. You've been an amazing, sexy audience. Be safe out there. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.